There were nights in medieval Europe when a feast could fill an entire hall with noise, boots scraping against stone, servants hurrying between benches. But beneath all the sound, beneath the laughter and the talk of harvests and war, there was one rule every guest understood before stepping through the door. Bring your own knife. Not a weapon, not a tool of the hunt, but the one object a man could trust when the food finally arrived. At the long trestle tables, boards laid loosely over wooden supports, nothing was secure. A stray elbow could tilt the whole surface, sending trenches, pitches, and scraps sliding toward the floor. Meals were not quiet affairs. They were crowded, unstable, and built on customs older than most who sat there. And yet, even in that chaos, there was order. A knife was more than cutlery. It was a sign that you belonged at the table, that you knew how to eat properly, how to carve cleanly, how to serve yourself without disturbing the guests around you. It was as essential as breath. There were no forks. Spoons were rare and costly, often tied to a belt so they wouldn't be stolen. Salt was shared from a single cellar. Food arrived on common platters, and each guest, rich or poor, was expected to manage it all with the blade he carried from home. In those halls, the meal did not begin with food. It began the moment a man placed his knife on the table, a quiet declaration that he understood the rules of the world he had just entered. Few today remember why a simple blade held so much authority, but in the Middle Ages, a knife could speak more about a person than his clothes, his manners, or even his birth. In a medieval household, the lord might own silver goblets, embroidered cloth, or carved wooden platters, but knives were not shared. They were personal objects, carried daily, sharpened often, guarded carefully. There were three reasons for this. First, most homes simply didn't have enough knives to offer. Metal was expensive. Even a basic iron blade represented hours of work by a smith, and a household might own only a few beyond what servants and family carried themselves. Second, knives varied wildly in quality. A well-made blade signaled wealth or status. A poor one showed the opposite. In some courts, a knife's handle, carved bone, polished horn, amber, silver, or even stones set into wood, revealed more about a person's position than his clothing did. Some nobles carried knives ornamented with pearls or rubies. King Henry VIII owned sets encrusted with jewels, precious enough to lock away between meals. Third, the knife wasn't just for food. It was a tool of travel, trade, and daily life. Something used to cut rope, shape wood, trim cloth, or light a fire. A guest did not part with it easily, nor expect another to lend one freely. Yet once seated at the table, the knife changed roles. It became the only object permitted to touch the communal platters, the roasted meat, the boiled fowl, the coarse bread torn into halves. A man carved for himself with the same skill he used in the fields or the workshop. He had to know how to cut cleanly, without scattering crumbs or sending sauce onto his neighbor. The blade was not merely a utensil. It was proof he understood the etiquette of eating among others, a small but significant test of discipline in a crowded hall. Medieval tables were never built to last. They were temporary structures, assembled for the meal and dismantled afterward. A long board rested on trestles, wooden supports that held everything from meat trenchers to pitchers of ale. But the boards weren't fixed to the legs. They simply lay on top. That meant one thing: stability was a myth. Guests sat shoulder to shoulder. Servants moved behind them with platters hot from the hearth. If one man leaned too far or pressed his elbows onto the table for balance, the entire board could tilt, sending half the feast sliding toward the floor in a cascade of bread, bones, and spilled drink. Courtesy books warned against resting elbows or leaning over dishes. The caution wasn't symbolic, it was practical. A careless gesture could ruin the meal for dozens. This fragile table also shaped how people handled food. There was no room for clumsy cutting or broad movements. Everything had to be done with the precision of someone carving in a narrow space. Quiet, controlled, mindful. In a setting like this, the personal knife became more than a tool. It was a way to navigate an environment that could turn chaotic at any moment. The table did not tolerate mistakes, and the people who governed it, stewards, marshals, lords, expected every guest to know the rules well enough to keep order in a place built without it. Before forks existed at the table, medieval diners used trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread or round wooden plates, to hold what they carved from the shared platter. The trencher wasn't just a plate, it was part of the ritual. A man carved a piece of meat from the communal dish, placed it on his trencher, and cut it into bite-sized portions. Then, and only then, did he bring each piece to his mouth with 3 fingers: the thumb, the index, and the middle finger. Not 2, not 5, 3. These were the clean fingers, the ones meant for eating. The others were reserved for holding the trencher, tearing bread, or steadying the knife. Courtesy books warned against using the wrong fingers, not out of superstition, but because fingers coated in fat could stain the tablecloth or smear the rim of the drinking cup. A diner who knew his role at the table avoided spilling, avoided staining, and avoided touching anything greasy before picking up his cup. Good manners were measured not by speech, but how gracefully a man handled food when dozens were watching. The trencher itself absorbed juices, fat, and bits of bread. After the meal, it was not thrown away. It was given to the poor waiting outside, soaked with gravy and flavor, a valuable donation to those who seldom saw meat. In this simple exchange, carving, sharing, giving, the knife, the trencher, and the fingers formed a system that governed every medieval feast. A system built on customs so familiar then and almost forgotten now. Forks existed long before medieval Europe, but they were not welcomed at the dinner table. For centuries, the fork was viewed with suspicion, an unnecessary luxury, a foreign custom, or even a symbol of vanity. Some monks wrote against it, some nobles mocked it. Many believed a man should be able to manage food with the same tools God had provided at birth, his hands. But there was a more practical reason, too. Forks were used for serving, not eating. Large kitchen forks speared meat from the cooking pot or turned fowl over the fire. But personal forks were rare. To hold a fork at the table was to suggest that one was too delicate to touch food, a trait few admired. Instead, diners relied on the knife. It could carve, lift, separate, and portion, everything needed for a shared meal. A man who carved properly showed self-control. A man who carved clumsily showed he was unfit for company. By the time personal forks finally gained acceptance in Europe, first in Italy, then slowly elsewhere, the medieval system had already passed. But during the height of the Middle Ages, the fork was an outsider in a world that demanded purpose and discipline. And nothing symbolized that discipline more than the blade each guest carried to the table. A knife was not merely something a guest used.
It was something he displayed. Blades varied in length, sharpness, and craftsmanship. Some were plain iron, polished thin from years of use. Others carried carved handles, metal caps, or decorations set with bone or amber. A nobleman's knife could match the value of a small chest of coins. A wealthy merchant might own a knife with silver inlays or initials etched into the handle. A higher-ranking guest might bring a blade that shone clearly even in the dim hall light. To carry a fine knife was to show that you understood the seriousness of the feast, that you came prepared, that you respected the host, and that you expected to be respected in return. A guest whose knife was dull, crooked, or poorly kept revealed something quietly embarrassing. He lacked discipline. He lacked preparation. He did not belong fully in the company he sat among. And the reverse was also true. A man who carved meat smoothly, portioned food cleanly, and passed dishes without spilling, earned silent approval from those around him. In a world where written records were scarce and reputation traveled by word of mouth, the way a man handled his knife could shape how others spoke of him long after the meal ended. The blade was small, but its meaning was large. Medieval meals were guided by dozens of rules, not to restrain guests, but to keep chaos from overtaking a crowded hall. Some came from courtesy books, some from local custom, some from generations of practice. A few of the most important. Do not blow on your food. Hot or not, it was seen as impatience and a risk to others if droplets scattered. Do not drink while food is in your mouth. Many died this way. Choking was a real danger. Do not pick your teeth with your knife. A man who did so had forgotten where the blade had been. Do not scratch your head. Touching the hair during a meal was taboo. Flakes or sweat could fall into the dishes. Do not lean over the table. It risked tipping the boards and spilling everything. Do not lick your fingers. Wipe them on your napkin or cloth, but never on your sleeve. Do not reach greedily toward the center platter. Take only what is near you. Passing too far was seen as aggression. Each rule protected the table from disorder, not symbolic etiquette, but practical habits shaped by real dangers and cramped spaces. People may imagine medieval feasts as wild, careless affairs. In truth, they were governed by structure. A man who knew the rules could eat among nobles. A man who ignored them might not be invited back. Women followed many of the same rules as men, but the expectations placed on them were often stricter and more visible. A 13th-century French poem advised that a lady should never dip her fingers too deeply into sauces, never smear her lips with grease, never take a piece so large that she struggled to chew gracefully. Her cup was to remain untouched until her mouth was completely clean. No glistening oil, no traces of fat. This was not vanity, it was reputation. A woman's place at the table determined how others judged her refinement, her upbringing, and the honor of the household she represented. One careless gesture, touching her face, staining her lip, lifting her cup too soon, could spark quiet whispers that followed her far longer than the feast itself. Men were expected to show discipline. Women were expected to show perfection. And while the rules differed, the knife remained central for both. A lady's knife was often smaller, decorated or crafted with a handle that fit her grip more naturally. But it served the same purpose, to show she understood the customs of the hall and to prove she had earned her place at the table.
Today, when we see a knife beside a plate, it feels ordinary, a tool that waits politely for whatever the kitchen prepares. But in medieval Europe, the knife carried weight. It was a symbol of readiness, discipline, and belonging. It marked a person as someone who followed the customs of the hall, someone who ate with intention, carved with care, and understood the world he sat within. The fork would eventually arrive. The table would change. Etiquette would evolve. But for centuries, a simple blade shaped how people shared meals, judged character, and moved through a society built on quiet rules. The feast began with it, and in many ways it depended on it. Everything else, the crowded tables, the shared platters, the 3 clean fingers, the bread trenchers soaked with gravy, circled around the knife that every guest carried from home. Not a weapon, not a threat, just the only tool allowed to touch the food. A small object that reveals, even now, how people once lived and how they once ate.